Uhuru, brothers and sisters and comrades, this is Omali Shatella. I'm chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, and I'm the leader of the International African Revolution. I want to appreciate everybody for coming on to this discussion today. I think it's a very important discussion. I have some important things that I'd like to share with you. The theme of this discussion today is Derek Chauvin trial. It's George Floyd, Derek Chauvin trial, and what about the white people? And we want to have this discussion because right now is a time where this issue of the trial of Derek Chauvin, the question of the murder of George Floyd is something that's dominating the media. And it's during a period of time where we see a lot of excitement happening in the world. And we see a particular kind of excitement being happening within the white world, and particularly inside the United States. The questions are being raised about things like how subsequent to the murder of George Floyd, we know within a 3-month period from May 26th, the day after George Floyd was killed, we saw there were something like 10,000 or more protest demonstrations, even uprisings inside the United States. And in more than 60 countries around the world, there were protests, demonstrations. There were statements of solidarity with George Floyd and with the struggle of African people inside the United States. And some people saw in these huge mobilizations that occurred inside the United States, so the numerous mobilizations, growing numbers, pictures of white people with their fist up, apparently expressing solidarity or support for the struggle of African people who were responding to this brutal colonial murder, this execution, this lynching, public lynching of George Floyd. And so that helps to raise the question about white people, because so much of the politic that had emerged subsequent to the defeat of our revolution had come to revolve around this issue of white people, and the white people are the enemy and the black people are not the enemy. And so if we have white people who are demonstrating in support of George Floyd, or in sympathy with his murder, support of the struggle of African people, then clearly that shows that it's not just an issue of white people and black people, that something else is at work here. And then this happens at the same time we've seen this January 6th, where all these white people attacked the Capitol and literally almost overthrew the government. And we saw this happen, and it was enthusiastic, feverish kind of occurrence that obviously was supported by millions of white people throughout the United States. And that's something that has been made clear subsequent to this January 6th mobilization by the number of people who still believe that Donald Trump is the legitimate president of the United States and that this election was stolen from them. And then subsequent to that, even as people are saying that what happened with what is happening now with this trial in the colonial court of Derek Chauvin being like a determinant thing for the issue of democracy inside the United States, and that this is the critical question, that this is the referendum on justice and the possibility of justice for African people. That's happening, you know that. But even as that's happening, we see the state of Georgia having enacted laws that's doing everything it can to complicate the ability of African people to even participate in the electoral process. And not only Georgia, though that's the thing that people are watching so closely, but more than 40 states in the United States have engaged in this process as well. So clearly, George Floyd is not the determining factor. The trial of Derek Chauvin is not the determining factor. And then something is happening with white people too that's causing some confusion for a number of people inside this country and perhaps around the world, because there's a lack of clarity of the role of white people and who white people are and why it is that they would be standing up for or with African people on the one hand, and why they would at the same time be people who supported this attack on the U.S. Capitol and the attempt to overthrow the United States government. So what we're hearing is, we've been hearing this for a while now, and this especially since the 2016 election that put Donald Trump into office in the White House as the US president. We're hearing this discussion about what about the white people, sometimes asked directly and sometimes inferred. And the inference we hear it when we hear about the question of fascism. Looks like we are being told that Trump is a proto-fascist, that fascism is upon us, it's right around the corner, it's on the horizon because of what we see happening with Trump and with the white people who are involved in the assault on the democratic rights of the people inside this country. And so that's one way the question of the white people is arrived at. Although it doesn't say what about the white people, it says what about fascism? But the truth of the matter is that the question of fascism does not arrive, does not even get talked about, does not even become a part of the discussion until something is happening to white people. And that the best examples historically of fascism, of course, is something that emerges in the 1930s when we see Mussolini in Italy, who defines and characterizes himself as a fascist, and who comes to power there in Italy. And then we see following that, like Hitler in Germany, and then Franco in Spain. These become the living examples of fascism, this horrible thing. And then, of course, the fascism of Hitler is the really defining issue because it resulted in 6 million white people being murdered by the United States, by the German government under the leadership of Hitler. And the government, the world, the white world has had a real problem dealing with that and defining that in an appropriate way because they've had to go so far as to make Hitler a madman or some kind of extraordinary force, and they take it out of any kind of political and economic context for the world. This fascism thing is this extraordinary thing that has occurred. And it has occurred now, and we know it's there because we see what Germany has done to other white people. In this instance, white people who are Jews. So this is the thing that we are confronted with. And so every time we see some kind of threat, a challenge to the security of white people coming from some political source, is characterized as fascism, that this is the thing. And then African people who whose brains have been captured by the white view, a colonial view of the world, also embrace this question of fascism. We say fascism is upon us. But the fact of the matter is what Hitler and the war that came that we attribute to fascism, the war that we see happening throughout Europe, in fact, during this period, is similar to the wars that have come before it. And these have been wars to redivide the world. These are wars that have been created in order to take territories and human beings for the advantage of one colonial power versus another colonial power. This is what it's all been about. This is what these fascist governments were involved in. They in the 40s, in the 30s and 40s, we see that some of the countries were that they were disappointed, or they no longer had unity with the agreements that had been made among the imperial or the colonial powers in the past that had divided the world up among themselves. And the critical thing that we would look at around that issue would be Africa, 1884 and 85, where white countries from around the world sat at a table in Berlin, Germany, and then divided up Africa among themselves. There was no saying that this is fascism that's going on. This is normal, that the white countries of the world got together, divided up all the black people and said, we're taking this group of black people in this territory and we're giving it a new name, and we're saying this is our possession. We became their possession. Of course, this is subsequent to the advent of colonial slavery that was initiated by Portugal in 1400 and something. That wasn't fascism, that was normal. That was a part of the whole process that gave rise to the social system that dominates the world today. But then we have this development where this in the first imperialist war was fought for the same reason: redivide the world among the colonial powers see who's going to get what. Germany lost so much of what it had considered its own possessions. And it felt like what happened with the so-called Versailles Treaty, where they attempted to create the League of Nations that would now limit the likelihood of white countries fighting among themselves by creating this body, this international body, if you will, this international parliament, if you will, this international Congress, if you will, where the colonial powers would be able to rule the world and all the colonized people, and without having to fight each other. They could come to agreements in some peaceful way. In fact, it was characterized as something that would guarantee an ongoing peace. And when they said peace, they meant peace among the imperialists, peace among the colonizers, peace among the colonial powers. And it didn't stick, in part because the United States could not be a party of it, even though Woodrow Wilson, who was the president of the United States, who at the time was the one who initiated this attempt to build the League of Nations. And so it existed in some ways for a time without the United States, and so it couldn't hold together. And so there was another war. And they are saying that this war happened because there was no common cause, no common unifying ideas and structures that held Europe and all of these powers to account, that set rules for how they would dominate the whole world. And so this United Nations was born from that as an attempt to maintain this peace, or to create this peace that came from the Second Imperialist World War. This is the time when we see the advent of fascism. This is the Germany that in its efforts to dominate the world, its efforts to rectify its relationship with colonialism, in contention, in competition with other colonial powers, created these horrible murders of other Europeans in Germany, in that vicinity. And of course, the Jews were the ones who we are talking about. And so this became the face of fascism, the emaciated Jews, the story of the Jews being put in the gas chambers. This became the question of fascism. At the same time, they're talking about fascism, then you are looking at countries like France fighting against fascism. France occupied by Germany, even though it was extraordinarily sympathetic to Germany and sympathetic to what Germany was carrying out into the politics and philosophy of Germany at the time. Much of France was sympathetic to that. And so you have France but it becomes like a so-called anti-fascist force. It becomes a part of a body, a group of countries fighting against fascism. The United States was engaged in the struggle against fascism. And so were other countries, but at the same time, France and England and the United States and other powers were supposed to be against fascism that was led by Germany at this particular time. At the same time, they were against fascism. Then the same France was involved in killing and dominating colonized people in Africa. And one of the most outstanding examples of that was Algeria. And it's outstanding because Algeria is where you saw the African people engage in a serious kind of revolutionary movement to remove itself from colonial domination. That was happening throughout other parts of Europe and throughout other parts of the world. And so here you have France, who is fighting against fascism on the one hand, but is engaged in colonial terror, colonial domination of African people. The United States, where mentioned was the national pastime, was in a fight against Germany too. German fascism is what it was fighting against, but it was lynching African people here. And it was lynching African people on territorial lands that were the land of the indigenous population, from whom created the conditions for the rise of the United States as a political force in the world, as an institution in the world. So here you have the United States created through stealing the land of the indigenous people against whom horrendous murder was created. And this was murder that was created for there was such a word as genocide that came into existence because of what Europeans did to other Europeans in Germany. That's where the definition of genocide comes from. But there was no genocide when they were killing indigenous people here. There was no concept, no term for genocide. There was no term for genocide. What they did when they snatched millions and scores of millions of African people from Africa and brought us to this land and then dispersed us around the world, where in some instances, the lifespan of an African was 7 years. There was no concept of genocide. There was no concept of fascism. Only time we hear the word genocide is when Europe is in this situation where it now has to try to create new rules for how Europeans would behave with each other in the struggle with each other, whether wartime or not. They create Nuremberg trials where they put some Europeans on trial for what they did to other Europeans, in this instance, Jews. But there was nobody who was going to Leopold and to the Belgian government was responsible for murdering more than 11 million African people just in Congo alone. There was no trial. There was no discussion of trial for what white America, what this country had done to the indigenous people here, and what they had done and were doing to African people at the very same time. The theft of Mexico, there was no trial, no discussion of genocide, no new creation of a concept that would define this phenomenon that we were looking at. And the reason there was no new creation is because this is the way capitalism works normally. This was a normal function of capitalism. And what we're looking at is when Europeans that have enjoyed what they like to characterize as bourgeois democracy, or that they like to characterize as the communists characterized as the so-called hidden dictatorship of the ruling class. There was nothing hidden about this dictatorship when it came to people in Africa, our people in this country, to the indigenous people, what was happening to the Philippines, all of these other places, what Leopold was doing to us in Congo. It was not hidden, it was wide open. And you know why? Because this is how capitalism is. This is the essence of capitalism. And the fact is that the capitalism that we're talking about, that we hate, and all of white people and all who are communists and leftists say they hate too, this capitalism rests upon a foundation. It gets its origin. It comes into existence through colonialism, through colonial slavery. This is the startup capital. The startup capital of capitalism came from selling Black people and taking our lands and territories and dispersing us around the world and destroying whole peoples throughout what we now call the Americas. This is where it came from. And I think it's really important for us to say that. So when we're talking about fighting against fascism, we're talking about white people. The question is, what about the white people? And when you hear the struggle, that the question coming up that we got to fight against fascism, what they're saying is this is a critical question, because there's a contradiction that's occurring where we see the European state, the capitalist state, the colonial power, the capitalist power now treating white people in some semblance, in some way, like they treat Africans and the rest of the peoples around the world. And so what is happening, what has to happen, is the colonized people, those of us here, those of us around the world have to put our struggles against colonialism on the back burner. Or if we don't put it on the back burner, we make this artificial, this false assumption that the white people who are fighting against what they call fascism are engaged in the same struggle that we engage in, and that's not true. Because the truth of the matter is, we've seen in history the fight against fascism. We've seen successful fights against fascism, but the struggles against fascism hasn't done anything to help African people, to help Mexican people, to help the indigenous people, to help the people of the Philippines, to help the people throughout the Americas. Hasn't done anything for them. It just solved the problem that existed among the colonizers themselves. So when we say, what about the white people? That's one of the things that we're looking at. So does that mean that we are not sympathetic? Because what we hear more and more, that's really startling to me, is that when we hear with this crisis developing and we see the energy that's emerging from the African people, and we see the leadership of the African People's Socialist Party defining this question of as colonialism, and saying that an objective, a critical objective of African people has to be the capture of political power, to become a self-governing people, and to extricate ourselves from this social system that exists at our expense. So now the question is, what about the white people? Well, because the system, it exploits everybody, we are told. And does capitalism exploit everybody? It exploits a whole bunch of people, but the way that question is introduced, it's dishonest and it's opportunist. because it didn't just start oppressing everybody when the white people discovered fascism. It was oppressing everybody for the whole duration of the existence of African people in this country, that the white left has been unable to deal with, the Marxists and any of the others of them. And then these Negroes, these deep and profound intellectuals in our own community who are talking about proto-fascism, and that's why we have to fight against this form of fascism, that form of fascism, this form of capitalism versus that form of capitalism, when all capitalism, what do you call it, finance capital, mercantile capitalism, whatever the hell you want to call it, all capitalism has its origin in the slave trade, in colonial slavery. This is where it comes from. This is what feeds it today. This is why you see crisis that's abounding today throughout the whole world economy, is because capitalism, colonialism is a world system, and capitalism is a manifestation, is a product of colonial domination of the peoples of the world. So what we're saying is that an honest response by the white left and by white people and by these Negro intellectuals, these entities that's smarter than everybody else, and who are so afraid of taking responsibility for our own future, who are afraid to remove themselves from the tit of white power. They are so afraid of that they have to make sure that they take care of the white folk too. And I'm not saying that we don't look it out for humanity, but I'm saying that any honest discussion about this recognizes that all of us, the future of humanity, rests upon the struggle against colonialism, upon which the whole rotten social system sits. So I think it's important for us to talk about that, because when we talk about what about the white people, we're not talking about giving all concessions. We're not talking about being some melanated people, and therefore because we are melanated, somehow we are better than anybody else. We're not race nationalists. Something to that effect. And I'm sorry that there's some melanated people, quote unquote, who might find that problematic. But that's truth of the matter is that melanation ain't had nothing to do with putting us here, and it ain't got nothing to do with getting us out of here. Science will, revolution will. And so you can have all the melanin that you want to have, and if you're not making revolution, you're going to live under colonial domination. You don't take power over our lives, we're going to live under colonial domination. So I think it's really important for us to be able to say that. So the truth is that we are not surprised by how white people are moving in the world today in the African People's Socialist Party. Comrades, brothers and sisters, and I'm speaking to all of you, not just inside the United States, but throughout the Caribbean, throughout Europe, and all the places in Africa where the party exists and where we are moving to exist daily. Because these are critical questions that we have to deal with in order to find our freedom, in order to win our freedom, because we find ourselves having to struggle with this. I was speaking in Sierra Leone some years ago, and talking in Sierra Leone among hundreds of African people in the audience in West Africa, about the struggle that African people had to make in the United States and in Africa for control of our own resources, for self-government, for the defeat of capitalism, et cetera, as a consequence of destroying colonialism. And somebody in the audience stood up. And this is somebody who has spent so much time in the United States to talk about how we have to be careful in this discussion because of our white allies. And just recently, even, and this has happened over and over again, even when we founded, in 1982, we founded the African National Reparations Organization as an organization that would put reparations on the map, that would make it a household word for Black people. We created an organization, the first mass organization in history that was designed to fight and lead the struggle against reparations. And the first person that we appointed to head that organization up only lasted for a day or two, because she, on a ride to wherever the hell she was going, someplace else with some white leftists, was convinced that we had to make sure that this struggle for reparations wouldn't alienate our white allies. What about the white people? Anytime the struggle heats up for African people, this question of what about the white people is something that surges to the surface and attempts to dominate the discussion and dominate what it is that we have to do and where it is that we have to go. This is historically true. In the 1960s, we said Black power, and what you hear coming from white people. What about the white people? This has always been the story. But we are not confused by it. We are scientists, we are revolutionaries, we are armed with the theory of African internationalism based on historical materialist analysis and investigation of the reality, the advent of capitalism in the world as a consequence of the attack on Africa and African people. I want to just share with you briefly, first of all, when you look at what happened on January 6th with the attack on the Capitol by white people. It's an interesting thing that was in the April 6th New York Times. It's an article that was written by someone named Alan Fuhrer, who reports on a study that was done by a political scientist whose name was Robert Pape. And the subtitle of this article reads, hundreds of people in a pro-Trump mob. Well, it talks about what motivated them. And the title of that was "The Fears of White People's Losing Out Permeates the Capitol Rioters' Towns." That where we placed the so-called Capitol rioters were located, what really influenced and informed them was the white people losing out. And so not poverty, not anything like that. And it's really important for us to understand this. And so here's what Fuhrer writes about the study done by Robert Pape, who is a political scientist, and said he was studying the issues that motivated the 380 or so people who were arrested in connection with the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, and said that he expected to find that the rioters were driven to violence by lingering effects of the 2008 Great Recession. He thought it would be the economic questions directly affecting them that would be the basis of what was happening. But what he's found instead, it says, was something very different. Quote, "Most of the people who took part in the assault came from places his polling and demographic data showed that were awash in fears that the rights of minorities, that's us, and immigrants, that's us, were crowding out the rights of white people in American politics and culture." And then he went on to say that counties with the most significant declines in non-Hispanic white population, the ones with the most significant declines in the non-Hispanic white population are the most likely to produce insurrectionists. This finding held true, he determined, even when controlling for population size, distance to Washington, unemployment rate, and urban or rural location. In his study, Mr. Pape determined that only about 10% of those charged were members of established right-wing, far-right organizations like the Oath Keepers, militia, or the nationalist extreme group, the Proud Boys. But unlike other analysts who have made similar findings, Mr. Pape has argued that the remaining 90% of the ordinary rioters were part of a still congealing mass movement on the right that has shown itself willing to put violence at its core. And I just want to say that this doesn't surprise us. And like I said, it's almost something that we predicted. And I can read from the political report from the African People's Socialist Party plenary in 2017. And that I think is really significant in terms of how we understood from a scientific basis. It's 2017. This is 3 years before the 2020 uprising by white people that almost overthrew the government. And we said then, we're talking about the African People's Solidarity Committee, because this is our response of what about the white people? Because the African People's Socialist Party has organized a front, a solidarity front of our party comprised of white people that itself has created this mass organization of growing numbers of white people that exist in almost 150 cities throughout the United States. What about the white people? Do you abandon the struggle against colonialism to play on this assumption that somehow the white people are the center of the universe and therefore we have to fight against fascism and therefore we can't make the struggle against colonialism because somehow that alienates our white allies, or that therefore we are all oppressed, exploited by the social system? He said no. So here's how the party took on this question from an African internationalist perspective. And it says here, and I'm reading from the Burning Spear of June 2017, And this is from the political report to our 2017 plenary process. This is the political report. It says, APSC, the African People's Solidarity Committee, is faced with more than mere organizational contradictions to resolve. The solidarity work is extremely important at this time of imperialist crisis. The majority of the colonizer nation, that's white people, the majority of the colonizer nation is in a state of economic, organizational, and ideological disarray. This is one of the things made obvious by the presidential election of 2016. We know that there is a deep sense of foreboding within the colonizer nation. There is growing drug addiction, and for the first time in generations, if not ever, the death rate of white people is on the uptick. The electoral process has not succeeded in luring them into a sense of control over their future, which appears to be jeopardized by the new norm of economic decline, despite the US government's boast of full employment. There's evidence that for the first time in recent history, North Americans of the colonizer nation, which is white people, are confronted with the probability that their children will not be as well off as they are, according to a November 2016 report by the McKinsey Global Institute. The white sense of security that accompanied the belief that the US had hegemony over the world's affairs has been shattered by the defiance from diverse forces as Venezuela, Iran, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, Russia, and China, etc. The election and also revealed that the majority of white people in the US appear to be ideologically adrift. The bedrock of ideological coherence has been untethered from the foundation of previous assumptions of permanent affluence and unquestioned US authority. The work of the African People's Solidarity Committee is occurring within this context. It is work that represents a major thrust by the party in our effort to advance our struggle against colonial capitalism. We have the genuine explanation of the material basis of the gloomy forecast for a white existence built and reliant upon slavery and colonialism. I say it again. We have the genuine explanations of the material basis of the gloomy forecast for a white existence built and reliant upon slavery and colonialism. APSC, that is the African People's Solidarity Committee, that is the solidarity front of the African People's Socialist Party, must discover innovative ways to engage the colonizer population in struggle, to see that their future has always been determined by a relationship to Africans and others who have suffered the consequences of white affluence. The majority of the white people did not believe in the message of Trump or Clinton. The popularity of the Bernie Sanders campaign that contended most effectively with the Trump appeal to white people was based on a false assumption that whites can continue to have an affluent life under colonial capitalism. The African People's Solidarity Committee is an important party vehicle for exposing this crisis. The solution is not something that will happen overnight. Whites of the colonizer nation have not simply been waiting for our party to come through with a magic elixir of African internationalism for instant relief. The African People's Socialist Party will have to develop and incorporate a strategic approach to this very important task. Also, African People's Solidarity Committee must initiate the movement for reparations within the population of the moneyed sector of the ruling class. The fact is that millions of white people are in distress, some by the outcomes of the 2016 presidential election. We must offer them all a way forward in defiance of the election outcome, and to the fullest extent possible, an opportunity to unite with our understanding of colonialism and reparations. The state of the fractured body politic of the US can provide us an excellent opportunity to affect the unity of large sectors of the colonizer population with its own ruling class and with the colonial domination of Africans and the oppressed of the world. Opening this front of struggle can only enhance our ability to put revolution back on the agenda within the US and throughout the world. This is not something that we just came up with the George Chauvin, the Derek Chauvin trial, or George Floyd murder. This is not just something that we've come up with now that white people are suddenly beginning to talk about fascism. We predicted more or less this when we talked about the crisis that was being experienced by white power, white people who are connected to living off of the resources of the people of the world. Every bit of happiness, every sense of security that white people enjoy comes as a consequence of the United States and Europe dominating the rest of the world. And now that is being shattered by the struggles of the peoples around the world against colonialism. This is the thing that shakes the security. This is the thing that shakes the foundation of the whole colonial capitalist social system globally. And we don't solve that by saying that what we have to do is fight against this faction of the white ruling class of the colonial powers. We fight against this in order to make sure that the other faction is there. Because the truth is that we suffer under colonialism. Whether that colonialism is what you might call a fascist colonialism or democratic colonialism, we suffer. And that African people catch hell under France today. France still has colonies in the Caribbean today. And so fascism was destroyed, they say, a long time ago. And so how does that help us in various places around the world? How does it help us that fascism is supposed to be gone? How does that help the indigenous people living in concentration camps today? No, the question has to be against colonialism that will liberate the oppressed peoples of the world, and the responsibility of white people who are of the colonizer nation is to join under the leadership of that struggle. And if you want to make sure that we effectively attack capitalism, you do so by attacking the base and the source of capitalism, which is the colonial extraction of value, wealth, both human and material, from the colonized peoples of the world, and including those especially of Africa and inside the United States. That's what we have to do. And so that's not to say that we don't think it's important that white people came out and will come out to mass demonstration. We think it's extremely important, which is why we do the work we do in the African People's Socialist Party, which is why I'm having this discussion with you today, brothers and sisters and comrades. Because you have to help those white people to get beyond themselves, the centrality of being white, the centrality of being the focus of the whole global human experience. You have to help them to understand that the only way forward is under the leadership of the colonized peoples, and especially under the leadership of the African working class, colonized people. And that's why we created the African People's Socialist Party. And we say that we're not fighting against a fascism, which means that the same system will continue in the same way it has. You just have a change in the form of the state. So instead of having the so-called democratic state that allows white people to vote for this and vote for that, and that somehow allows Black people to vote for this and that, but never changes the fact that we have the same relations of power as a subjugated population that we had yesterday. Instead of fighting, saying that our struggle has to be for that, instead of coming up with this false whining hope that the white people love us kind of politic that does not even give white people an opportunity, demand that white people be engaged in self-criticism and unite under the leadership of a revolution that will overturn the social system that they say they hate so much. This is what we have to do. This is what the party has to do. This is what the African Revolution has to do. This is what the African People's Socialist Party has to do. This is what the Uhuru movement is all about. We say, what about the white people? They say the white people have to take the same chances as the rest of us in the world. And the rest of us are fighting against colonialism. And the way we know we get free is because we defeat colonialism. And white people have to get with that, get under the leadership of that process. And so they're not fighting for white rights. They're fighting to destroy colonialism that's rooted in the oppression of Africans and other peoples around the world. That's how you do it. So we want white people to come out to the demonstrations, but we want white people to be informed by the science of revolution. We say that the ability to defeat capitalism relies upon our ability to overturn the social system. But if the only thing you want is to make sure that white people live well, is to make sure that the conditions that's imposed on Black people and the indigenous people are not imposed on white people, then you fight against fascism. So the system cannot continue in the same way if we are going to be free. White people constitute a minority of the people on the planet Earth. Any philosophy, any analysis that presupposes that this minority of white people on the planet Earth controls what the future is going to look like is absolutely insane. In fact, we are fighting against minority control of the planet Earth. In this instance, what we are saying is that the colonialism is that where the minority are trying to control the vast majority of the people. And among the minority, of course, you have this ruling elite that white people like to call the 1%. They might be the 1%, but white people do not constitute the 99%. Because suddenly they become a part of the 99% in the same way they say, we're in this together, we're struggling against fascism. The truth of the matter is something like 80% of the people on the planet Earth are trying to survive off pittance as compared to white people. So the ordinary colonizers will have to choose. And we say, what about the white people? The white people will have to choose whether they will abandon this voluntary isolation from the rest of the peoples on earth. That is consequence of having all the resources of the peoples of the earth being in your communities, in your neighborhoods, in your countries, while the rest of us are left to starve under colonial domination by governments that you support. So this is how we deal with the question of the white people, because we do want white people to be free, like everybody else. But white people can't be freer than anybody else. And white people are going to have to suffer the consequences of a revolution, because they will not have the same kinds of what, like some Africans like to talk about, white privilege. There ain't gonna be no colonizer privilege. The colonizer will not have privileges. In fact, the more privileges are going to exist under the dictatorship of the African working class, who will come to power through the revolutionary organization of the African People's Socialist Party. If you want more information, and you should come to apspuhuru.org. We are building the revolution. And not just here. This is not just a discussion. You investigate the party and you see that we are all over the world, and that we're growing all over the world. And that what distinguishes us is that we're not whining and begging and things like that. We're in the process of preparing to govern, and we are putting in places the instruments of government, and we are building economic institutions independent of the ruling class in this country. And in fact, they're in contention with the colonial economy that exists and dominates the rest of the world. Go to apspuhuru.org and you can become a part. If you are a settler, if you're a part of the colonizer population, you can become a part of this party organization. You can become a part of the Solidarity Front of the African People's Socialist Party. So go to apspuhuru.org. Look up who we are. Look up the African People's Solidarity Committee. Look up the Uhuru Solidarity Movement. This is the revolutionary movement that's sweeping the globe, and we are winning. Uhuru.